Hello everyone, today we talk about the costs of the knightly panoply in the 13th century in relation also to the compensations and more in general in this century that we have already addressed relatively to these issues. We made a video about, for example, the monetization of 13th century warfare, the weighting of the equipment and the same. And that appears in fact as a century of transition, a century in which Europe properly in fact entered in its more financiary dimension, we can say, that in fact is connected to the major investments of the time that were obviously the ones about war, at least in a kind of a more directional way. I mean, of course, trade went on its own, but naturally armies were now to be put together by powers that had certain measures of control, but also of centralization, the ability of providing supplies, etc. There are many contradictions in a way, because the 13th century is, in fact, the true century of feudalism, right? This is the apex. In many ways, we've looked at it through Bouvines, through this other, through the establishment, in fact, of the Frankish-derived military model throughout all over Europe, we can say, in a various degree of irradiation, we could say. But on the other hand, it's the moment of the of its crisis. Like, once you reach the top, this thing begins to become obsolete in a way, and to need new systems of function. Right, as we know, and as we have seen many times, the 13th century is also the peak of feudal warfare, but at the same time over chivalry in many ways. But at the same time, it's paralleled by an astonishing growth of other military systems, such like the one of the free communes, of the infantries, right, crossbow, right. So this is a system that becomes ever more dynamic, integrated, and actually that presents much higher degree of destruction, of imbalance, and uncertainty, right? We often attribute to the idea of an expansion of a growth, especially a financial one, to just everything's fine. But actually, during the 12th, the 13th century, if you look at the systemic impact of wars, of of epidemics, of misfunctions, failures of the system here and there, right? It starts being on a larger scale and trying to modify society, therefore, in a more impacting way. Definitely, warfare has to do with this. Think about trebuchet warfare, that puts in crisis the older systems of fortification, just like the artillery 200 years later will oblige a bit more of centralization. Here, the national monarchies are born later. The modern state would be born for the sake of having enough resources to concentrate in the construction of major infrastructures, fortresses, etc. are always larger, always more functional, and to play much more strategically properly meant. That is to say, you don't just go to war like you're going to football match like with your fellow vassals that are, however, somewhat your peers, and you go out there just to break some bone, to capture someone, and it ends there. No, this starts becoming vicious, bloody, risky, and actually on a much greater scale, right? So it really presents a degree of destructiveness that was unprecedented at this point. So today we'll talk about something relatively more, boring, from what more numerically based and less action oriented in this sense, but that has to do properly with what were the costs of a panoply, and how much were the retributions about, right? And not even talking about the later aspect, because that we'll talk about on another occasion or in parallel here, but considering fundamentally what was the ratio cost benefit to properly the feudal relation as such at this point, because that at this point mercenaries, as a consequence with professionalization of warfare, start becoming fundamentally the base of what essentially European armies would be up to the 17th, the 18th century. This idea of the free companies that go roam around. At the beginning, this century, there's something smaller, like maybe 2, 3, 10, 20, 30 people, like at the end of the century, maybe 50, maybe 100, maybe 300, hell, even more. But later on, becoming kind of autonomous, semi-nomadic military states that will come, as you know, to ravage the countryside, living off the land and selling their services to the best offer. But we undergo this transition where we see that the collapse of that feudal system we were saying before. The idea that you don't go to war because you have enough land to provide troops and equipment and training. The land that I gave you as a king, right, and that you have to serve in the virtue of, right. This has never actually been the reality ever, right, since the very beginning, because people had always been paid to serve in that regard. But at this point, there is more than that. There is probably the detachment of the connection with the land, right? Not broadly from an economical point of view, because of course the wealth is fundamentally the land anywhere, but it's the system of recruitment and of pay that is detached from the land, right? In order to have a war horse and a squire and a valet and your panoply and their panoplies, by the way, because they also the squires now become fundamentally identical to the knights at this point. There is also, this has important impacts even in tactics, etc. But you pay for it. You pay it in cash. Like, weapons are starting to become actually very cheap. Like by the 14th century, like even an archer could buy a sword without much of an expense. There is a lot going on, right? That eludes the battlefield in this regard. But it's the fact that at that point you just serve someone, not by training on a fief all your life, right, on the base of these possessions, but basically just roaming around and selling your services, right? As we were saying, this had always been a thing, right? And also we shouldn't forget that nobles are most of the times actually the same people who make this job, right? There is definitely a widening of the social, a deepening, if you want, the social extraction of these mercenaries that also become knights in many ways. But it's obvious that, if you look by especially the beginning of the 14th century, where this system has become, you see hundreds, if not thousands of knights to serve, and you realize that those are not knights, right? They're probably, heavy cavalry, but, whether they were son of peasants, that doesn't matter, right? The commanders were really noblemen, were really people even of very high rank, because sometimes we find even literally princes and kings that serve in this regard. Look at John of Bohemia in the 14th century. He was not a king. He was a knight errant, like many others, right? And, or better, he was both things. But, you would think a king wouldn't do that as well. Well, they did, right? And naturally, this reveals at that point also so many other things now we can't talk about politically and socially in Europe. But sticking to the 13th century now, we can give some data here. So first, also, given the sources, the documentation, consider that 13th century is the moment in which this boom results also in the finally in the production of enough sources that this arrive to us in decent quantity and quality, right? So it's very rare actually by the end, before the end of the 13th century, to have satisfactory data about, the equipment, the costs, the equipment, and so on. This is stuff you start seeing for the first time in France, in Italy, the places that were more on the lead on this whole transformations, and that had, systems of recording. They were actually starting a real bureaucracy. Always remember that bureaucracy is not invented in 18th century France. It was something that was invented between Paris, Avignon and Naples, and Avignon/Rome, depending. I was thinking about the 14th century, but the 13th century Rome, or wherever the papal curia was at that point, because they might, they also roamed around. And so in this 12th Angevin, papal Angevin system, right? And therefore we start finally having some reliable data, right? And the picture we get is naturally what we already knew in many ways from many other sources, but not quite quantifying the price as such so precisely. Enormous. Like, this is like if you have if you have a full panoply with like a war horse, like for a knight, right? So for knight's equipment, war horse and spare horses, by the way, because by the way they had different types of horses. You know, the stallion, the runner, the roan scenes, right? For the knight, and for the knight, you know, that could field different mounts according to the tactical employment, also naturally for the squires, as we've seen, and the other servants. And varies, let's say, from, you know, knights of gold to golden spurs of the normal miles, let's say, urban miles. It's like between having a private jet or a Ferrari. That's the kind of you know, equation you could draw. And it's really, as you understand, an enormous thing. And you understand what was the you know, the political social commitment of these people. That is, you can't look at them as mere soldiers practically, but, you know, something more that wants to take over, and that by the 14th century will bring in fact, on the long run, to this kind of refeudalization of warfare with the mid 14th century. While in the first part, you know, there was still a strong popular push, as we have seen many times. So we know that in Genoa, for example, between let's say in the first half of the 13th century, helm known as barberio, which actually is very similar to the barbute of later times. So it would be interesting to analyze at this time what kind of type this really was, and it involved even at least some kind of also neck protection, because it's about a bird, right? The etymology, and it covered, you know, the part from, you know, below your, let's say, your chin and your neck. It costed between 16 and 32 shillings. An hauberk between 120 and 152 shillings. And if you add to these the greaves and other different devices, you could arrive to 200 shillings. That is 10 Genoese livres. That equates to something like 800 grams of silver. You also have to take in consideration, naturally, the offensive armament. Even if, you know, we're talking about something simpler, like, for example, for a squire, right? Or even just for the valet, that they were starting being equipped decently. And it's not exaggerated at this point to value the complete equipment of the knight at something like 1,400 grams of silver, and of his retinue of something like 15 grams. That is basically 1 month and let's say between 1 month and 1 month and a half of pay, right? And at this time, I think it's relatively early in the 13th century. And consider, however, that at the thresholds of the 14th century, according to the accounts of the Exchequer of England, an armor comprising a cassock, an hauberk, a helm, and iron mittens costed, on average, one sterling. That means maximum like 10 days of pay of a knight, right? So the thing could vary. And even here, the measures, the units of, you know, the coins, etc. You know, I can't tell you exactly now how the correspondences, the monetary variations went in this regard between various eras and times in Europe. In France, in 1295, the offensive and defensive armament of equipment of a crossbow, right? So a lesser trooper, at least compared to the knights, comprehended a crossbow, actually an armor protection for the neck, a quiver, and baudrier, a helm, a tunic under the down to the knees, and a sword, right, that came to cost up to maybe 3 tournois livres. Right, so we start seeing that there is a process also of awakening of the troops in general, and not just of the knights. So you start seeing, as we were saying before, also common soldiers being equipped in a much heavier way, and also with weapons that are much more devastating than before. Think about the improvements in crossbow technology, etc. But it's the professionalism here that really makes the difference, after all. And what is clear about the the costs is that the mounts, the war horses, were by far, the higher cost of the war equipment. Let's call it this way. There is a group of knights hired by Alphonse of Poitiers in 1242, and there is an estimation of how much the horses costed, and this indicates prices that went between 5 to 60 Tournois livres, with an average of 30, which means with the Genoese example, that is more or less actually from the same time, you see that it's thrice the equipment of a knight proper. So the horse costed twice as much, and this actually reflects largely the general logistical problem. This changes entail just in the organization of the armed forces per se, right? The horses eat and drink an astonishing amount of stuff every single day, and just a certain specific one, you have to provide it for it, and you have to fight with it. So if you don't give them constantly, this is just early upkeeping the thing, right? It's not about fighting for one day, it's going campaign for months, right? Which is something that traditionally, in fact, was considered like an enormous effort that vassals went to war like for some week, fundamentally. They were paid to do that, and this was an enormous cost. But in this century, you also have the increase in power, actually in coercive power, of the same monarchies, right? The same polities in general, whether they're principalities, communes, or whatever. And in 1269, different war horses were acquired in view of the crusade of Saint Louis, of Louis IX of France, in the fairs of Champagne and of Bar-sur-Aube, Lagny-Provence. And these horses costed, on average, 85 Tournois livres. Right, but we are probably talking here about some of the most expensive mounts ever. Right, the most prized breeds were the ones from Spain and from Apulia. Right, these were lands of a ancient horse breeding tradition for war proper. Right, and there was also this international market, as you understand, developing. So this was fine stuff, and the fact that it was sold in France at these high prices, it tells you here it's probably for the elite, right, for the very elite of the. In fact, the greatest chivalric elite in Europe. So not surprising to see this combination, frankly. And inside of the campaign in Flanders in 1302, right, against the French against the Flemish, during which it was maintained at the expenses of Robert II, Count of Artois. It was maintained at the expenses of Philip IV, the king. From May the 26th to July the 15th, right? In fact, Robert had acquired for himself and for his retinue certain mounts, the price of which we know. And there are these great horses, one of which from Spain, at the average price of 280 livres from Paris. 8 horses without better, qualification at the average price of 115 livres. Two palfreys at the average price of 15 livres. A runner for 60 livres. 14 roncines at the average price of 34 livres, and 3 roncinettes at the average price of 12 livres. Right. So we see here, which reflects the segmentation of cavalry and cavalry types at this point. Even we are at the apex of some of the exasperation of the various the increase of cavalry proper importance in some ways, but of the also the increase of the types of the diversification, we could say, of the retinues overall, right? And the creation, as a matter of fact, of true companies here that serve as in larger units with in this case, say, tens of people, always given that there weren't just knights in here, that there weren't just actually cavalrymen in the first place. And there is to say that by 1302, the announcement for the expeditions against the Flemish might have had the prices levitate, right? And that, this guy was now, paid by the same King of France, so he had the right connections. He could pay for definitely without thinking much about the consequences for himself specifically. And also this time the average, the exchange money was in full devaluation, right? Considering that the silver mark is equated to 50 tournois solidi by 1266 and 61 tournois solidi by 1295, right? And on April the 23rd, 1302, it had risen to 100 tournois solidi. So these prices are very high, right? For the great horses especially, it doesn't match, but it makes you realize exactly what we were saying before about the imbalances, the great subversion, if you want, of the same order of society and politics, right? This is in a few months there will be, in fact, the defeat of the French army at the hand of the Flemish commoners in the same campaign here at Courtrai, and that is really the reality of forces that are spreading like crazy and that cause these imbalances and make also prices being less traceable in a linear consistent trend. So these things, especially about monetary economy, are very difficult to actually follow precisely, because we don't know extremely much after all. We know that the war horses of the Templars that were bought in the West, in the Holy Land, were as costly as 100 Byzants, right? This is very important, by the way, because the Templars had Western mounts imported. We made a video about this, right, about on the Western mounts during the Crusades and the Reconquista, and there is actually a great reliance of the European breeds from the side of, also in this case, of the military orders and their needs. So these horses naturally were not just an exception. Like the costs were not just an exception. That these beasts were imported because they were structurally needed for specifically military purposes, right? In a systematic way. In Florence, in 1277, the city hired a certain number of Provençal knights, and in the clause of the contract is contemplated that each one of them had to dispose of a horse of the value of at least 30 livres, that is equating to 133 days of pay. So here the commune basically wants to increase the quality of the troops that it's hiring, right? So to say that there were naturally ways to check whether the mounts were as good as they were required. So it was not a way to, this shows a strong central authority that checks, of course, whether the mercenaries they want to speculate on their contracts, and the Florentines were quite careful about their money in general. And it's for these reasons in general that kings, princes, urban authorities sometimes imposed to every one who had the means, right, to maintain a war horse, right? We've seen it many times. This happened, for example, in Florence, in Siena, and other Italian localities where there were opposite commissaries ad equos imponendos, which in Latin means literally to impose the recruitment is implied of the horses, right? It's the normal sensual recruitment system, right, that existed since Germanic times. The idea, the more you have, the more you contribute. It's also, actually in the late Roman times it was similar to that, but the imposition is on the horse, right? You need mounted troops. This is something really old, actually, that, however, in these offices, etc., shows the centrality at this point of Western history of cavalry properly meant, right? It was an enormous business revolving around this, exactly at a communal level, right? The Italian communes are well documented in this regard because they also have an interesting political institutional history relatively to their, the maintenance of their cavalry forces that were, at the beginning just a prerogative. The thing evolves over time. But just to make some examples, this time in Florence, the number of horses to maintain was of 1,400 in 1260, right? Of 1,000 in 1310, of 1,300 in 1312, right? And we see here the thing swung, right? The idea is that these were also ad hoc requirements, like the imposition of the so-called cavallate, as they were called in Florence. Properly, the citizen cavalry, right, was detaching itself from the general exercitus, right? The idea that literally everybody had to serve, not quite just people that of course had the means, but also there was a sort of negotiation with the whole community to say how many of these horsemen should we maintain ready, right? This was not even just for, of course it was in view of military expeditions, but it was also just a way to say, okay, I don't know, there is the next emperor that descends in Italy, and we have to say sharp, okay, let's impose these cavalry forces to be maintained ready for combat, so that, according to the needs we will employ it. Because we have seen, by the way, how, costly. Think about also the damage to the same horses, like if they were employed. So you think about all the people that worked for producing the armor, the shoeing, all this stuff. So you imagine an entire economy gravitating around this stuff. And consider that cavalry in this context is decisive, tactically speaking. So if you want to fight a war, you can't do without, right? So in 1222, before this, in the attempt to obtain literally from the document, augmentatio militarum Crete, that is to say, literally, the increase of the military forces in Crete, Venice imposed to each Cretan like Venetian colonist in Crete, knight, having a so-called militia integra, right? That is to say, basically the amount of money, right, patrimony to, or its equivalent in a way, in an administrative sense, for maintaining a war horse. In fact, to maintain a war horse, right, as here miles is from which militia here comes from, is literally the knight. Remember this, right? That the miles in Latin is, back in the day was the legionnaire, right? At this point, because the etymology stands literally in the idea of he receives the pay for the mile, actually, back in the time of Vey. So here, literally, these are seen as the guys that even overseas in the possessions out of Venice must be levied, right? And this war horse had to cost at least 75 Venetian livre. So you see that even in here, right, it's not just about the mercenaries that wanted to scrap up, like to speculate on their contracts, but this was applied naturally to everybody. There's the myth that mercenaries are less faithful than citizens. It's utter, a delusion. There were enormous problems to commit the population to participate to war in general everywhere, right? Everybody wanted to escape that because these were really enormous costs. Right? This was not just about serving in the military, because you could basically commutate that. You could simply pay for someone else to go in your stead. But the point is, if you had enough money, you had to contribute for the horse, and naturally that was the main problem now. And in addition to the 75 livre, you have to add 2 mounts and 2 squires. Right, so these are literally knights of a very high level, as you understand here, and they're basically the standard knight, as it's yeah, I mean, it's properly the elite by 1222. And the squires, by the way, this is another, you know, condition, do not have to be of Greek origin. That is to say, these people have to be, they do not have to be locals, rather. So that they have to serve as part of broader commitment to the Venetian, cause, or as clients, or as maybe same Venetians or parts of the family, things like these, but not being Cretans. And then there were also the enfeoffed people, that Venetians, that disposed of just of a media militia, which means medium militia, so called, that on their side had to provide a horse of at least 50 Venetian livres for themselves, right? More amount for a squire. So here you see the segmentation of cavalry already at this point. That makes you realize how by the 13th century already, European cavalry was definitely already a developed thing, right? It wasn't just the average knight, just coat of mail and shield lengths. It's the works. Even the equipment was getting more diversified in this sense, in terms of lighter or heavier, right? And the thing is happening fast, but not everybody, in fact, is socially, economically can afford that price. So that's why we find this segmentation. In 1279, the King of France, Philip III the Bold, ordered to all the knights and to all the, let's say, gentlemen of his own kingdom, having a lands more than 200 livres tournois worth, and also to all the bourgeois that dispose of 1,500 tournois livres or more, to a brood mare. Right? So here we see from one side the landowner that is, is going to provide these, this breeding, this horse breeding, like a normal thing, right? The knights and the gentlemen were meant as landowners to have that more easily, but also those who owned 1,500 tournois livres. They were talking about merchants most of the times, well-off citizens in this regard, commoners in general. They also had to contribute. So here is even the importance of the monetization proper. In the second case, there is no connection with the land, right? It's about every kind of good. Just be cash, right? But if you have it, you have to provide a broodmare. Also dukes, counts, barons, abbots, and the great men, literally, that had enough land for grazing, they will have to breed either 4 or 6 brood mares, right? This is interesting because it really fits, like those who have the means have to contribute so without, like if you have it, right, just if you have enough land, that here it's, I don't know whether it's quantified or not in document, but it makes you understand if you have already the ready means to have it, okay, just have those mares. If you don't, just pay something for it, then you can imagine these people would simply buy the brood mares fundamentally. And to actually properly to maintain them here, I think it's the case, because I don't see otherwise. I don't know. The thing might have been more complicated as an agreement, but I don't have here the information, enough information. Then there is a decree of Edward I of England of 1282 that, acknowledging the lack of great horse, quote, apt to arms in England, prescribed to all of his subjects that had at least 30 sterlings of land to maintain from there on, in order to serve the crown in case of need, quote, a mighty horse, a mighty and apt to the fight, right? Horse, a warlike horse, with the relative armor. right? This is it. I don't know here whether the armor is referred to the horse or to the knight, because you know that armor in form, even non-metal pieces that actually from this time are beginning to appear more consistently, was there. So here it's not just about the idea of having the horse, but is being able to serve on it, or at least to properly field someone that is apt to fight, right? The horse is to be apt to fight here. This is very interesting. So these data may sound altogether disharmonious. Some are fragmentary and even contradicting each other, but they conclude, they allow us to conclude that by the 13th century, the capital represented by the defensive and offensive equipment, right, and of the mounts of a knight and of its retinue, was worth, given the pace of the time, between the 6 and the 8 months of daily pay. Right, it's been possible to calculate that in England, towards the mid-13th century, the equipment of a knight, including the horses, equated to 1 year of income, that is 20 sterling livres. Right, so what does this mean exactly? Well, that the constituted powers of the time disposed, without much of an expense actually, of an enormous investment that it could employ at their own will, albeit only for a few days or for some weeks, right? And the point here is the following. Of course, they would find always someone who would fight more than that, and they would have to find the money for it, right? And that was always an enormous problem here. It's basically the basic problem of every kingdom by this point. But the service was on average just of a some day in the year. Is evident that the pays that were corresponded, even if they had been generous, they couldn't correspond to the immobilized capital and its maintenance, right? We've seen it how for example in the 1279 French demand to the subjects, also the 1282 English one, how in order to have those horses you had to to pay with your own means, right? You had to pay with the means that derived either from the fief or from the money you had. So now this would make us open another chapter of the story. It is, how did this whole system freaking work? Like, how do we know actually what was the coercive power of the crowns? How much could they control the population, the subjects? The thing is one constantly, right? You can't really tell. But all in all, the idea is that these countries are fundamentally consolidating their territorial control proper over the communities, right? This is not just about the land or the money. It's about the people who have to work for this stuff, and that therefore these people are increasingly obliged to pay in this regard. And there is no surprise that on the long run this thing will transform itself into basically a monetary contribution, right? This time still there is the vassals that serve, but the idea is that these guys paid fundamentally too much, right? Even if they fought just for, as we've seen, just a few days sometimes, or a few weeks. However, the cost for what they brought on the field was enormous compared to the pace they received back, right? So just for having that, just leave aside the logistics, like how you bring the horse there, right? Yeah, but you have to upkeep those things. You have, first of all, to purchase the armor. You have to maintain it effective. The same goes for the war horse, and this costs really a lot to maintain that stuff available, right? It has a huge cost that even the small, let's say the short time of service cannot compensate for. So who's winning here is actually the central authority, right? And it's very interesting that this data come from places like England, France, or the Italian communes, because this is the places exactly that are advancing far in this direction. I mean, the idea of creating something more state-like within their own, competencies, because they fundamentally manage to control the population. They have, a certain degree, a certain consensus that keeps the system working after all. Elsewhere, the situation is probably more primitive than it seems, but the problems are similar, right? We can say it was more primitive, I don't know, in places like Spain, for example, or even certain areas of Germany, etc. But it's obvious that the more you go, especially north and east, the thing is much more like archaic, at least a system of recruitment, than what is happening in this very century in these countries here. But aside from this, this is more or less what we wanted to talk about. It's a relatively short video, actually, and we should talk about also the revenues of the fiefs and all this stuff, but this was just for saying, how the picture is about, and then we'll come back on the topic on another moment, always remembering what this whole thing meant, right? An increase of power from the side of central authorities, an increase of monetization of service, and the increase of professionalization of the military service in general, right? And of warfare in general. I mean, of how the world mechanism was standing, and the coexistence between the feudal system and this newly professional forms of warfare in ways that we still have to address. But for now, this was just about this aspect. So, for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.